Welcome and settle in for a while, because tonight we are going to drift toward one of the strangest chapters in the long sleep of the ancient world. Long after the first pyramids had risen above the western desert, long after the names of the old builders had already become distant even to later Egyptians, there came a time when the land of the Nile was ruled, at least in its northern reaches, by kings who were not quite Egyptian, and not entirely foreign either. That is where we begin, not with a crash of bronze, not with walls in flames, but with a quieter and more unsettling picture. Egypt, old and proud and full of memory, lying under the rule of men from beyond its familiar horizon. There is something almost dreamlike about that image. The river still rises and falls, the marsh birds still call in the reeds, the temple lamps still burn, scribes still bend over papyrus in careful silence, farmers still watch the floodplain darken with rich silk. And yet, at the center of political life in the Delta, the royal household speaks in more than one language. The court wears Egyptian ceremony and also carries the habits of another world. Even the idea of what it means to be king has begun to shift. Just a little, like sand moving in a night wind. For a long time, the Hyksos were remembered through the anger of those who came after them. Later Egyptian rulers would describe them as outsiders, intruders, foreign masters, who had to be driven out so Egypt could be made whole again. That memory matters, and before this night is over, we will come to it. But the softer and stranger truth is that their age was not simply a story of conquest. It was also a story of doors opening, of customs crossing borders, of merchants, scribes, soldiers, craftsmen, farmers and families finding themselves in a world that had grown wider than the old one. So the question that will carry us forward is a quiet one. How does a land as ancient and self-assured as Egypt come to be changed from within by rulers who begin as strangers? And what happens when a people strong enough to reshape a kingdom discover that reshaping it is not the same as keeping it forever? Those questions can wait a little. For now, all you need to do is let the old Nile Valley grow dim and spacious around you, and allow the way into this story to open slowly, with the night roads leading north toward Avaris. If you listen closely, you can almost feel the pause before the story begins in earnest. A civilization that seems eternal is already in the middle of becoming something else. And because change so often arrives in history without announcing itself, the only proper way to notice it is to move gently, to watch the lamp glow on water, and to follow the river toward the city where so many worlds will meet. Imagine the Delta at night, not the monumental stillness of stone temples under desert stars, but a softer country of water channels, mud brick walls, storehouses, reed beds, mooring posts, and slow black reflections under moonlight. Avaris does not rise from the earth like a single statement. It gathers itself, it spreads, it breathes. It is a city of crossing, where land and water almost seem to negotiate with one another, and where every path might lead either deeper into Egypt or outward toward the Levantine coast and the roads beyond. The air here is heavy with river damp, and the faint smell of grain, fish, oil, wool, bitumen, cedar shavings, and old cargo rope. Somewhere beyond the nearest wall, a donkey shifts in its sleep. Somewhere else, a watchman taps the butt of his spear against packed earth, more for rhythm than alarm. Lamps burn in courtyards. A child coughs once, then goes quiet. The city is not asleep all at once, it settles in layers. At the harbor edge, hulls rest against posts, dark with moisture. Some boats are narrow river craft, with forms Egyptians would have known for generations. Others show details from northern shipbuilding traditions, small differences in rigging, shape, or fastening that hint at long coastlines and unfamiliar harbors. In the storage yards, jars stand in ranks, baskets are stacked under linen covers, seals harden on damp clay. Goods within them have traveled farther than many kings once imagined worth the trouble. If you pass through the market quarter now, when the clamor has mostly faded, you begin to understand why Avaris mattered. By day, it is a city of weights, dyes, fibers, bronze fittings, ledgers, and negotiation. By night, it becomes something gentler, almost intimate. The bilingual murmur of the streets still lingers in the plastered walls. A painted doorway shows an Egyptian protective sign. Beside it hangs an amulet from another tradition entirely. A household shrine burns before images that do not fully belong to one world or the other, and yet somehow belong to the people who live there. That is the quiet genius of Avaris. It is not only a capital. It is a threshold. People come here to sell, to serve, to settle, to marry, to translate, to rise, to begin again. Some arrive with goods from northern cities. Some were born in Egypt, but now live in a city whose daily rhythm has been altered by foreign rulers and foreign neighbors. Some carry memories of another homeland. Others have only inherited those memories secondhand, through recipes, stories, names, and gestures around the evening meal. And because the city is a threshold, it is never only one thing. It is Egyptian and not. It is foreign and not. It is administrative and commercial. Practical and symbolic, muddy and splendid, crowded and hushed. Under the moonlight, it does not ask to be judged too quickly. It asks only to be entered. And as we move farther in, past the walls, the quays, the workshops, and the sleeping courtyards, the larger question waits for us. Who exactly were the Hyksos, these rulers who made a place like this possible? And what kind of world rose with them? The old Egyptian word later used for the Hyksos carried the sense of foreign rulers, chiefs from other lands, men connected to regions beyond the northeastern edge of the Nile world. But that sounds too sharp, too sudden. It is because history often gets flattened when later victory tells the story. The Hyksos did not appear out of nowhere like a storm over an empty field. Their rise belongs to slower movements. Traders had long crossed into the delta. Families had settled there. Craftsmen, soldiers, herders, and merchants from the lands of Canaan and Syria had made lives in Egyptian territory in years when central power was weak, divided, or distracted. Egypt itself had entered one of those periods when the old confidence of the state no longer held every border, every nome, every official house in perfect alignment. Dynasties weakened, authority thinned, regional powers mattered more. In such times, new people do not always need to conquer dramatically. Sometimes they simply become useful, then familiar, then indispensable, and finally powerful. The Eastern Delta, always more exposed to movement and exchange than the stone heartland farther south, became the place where that slow transformation could happen. So when we speak of the Hyksos tonight, it is best to picture not a single tribe descending at once, but a network of communities and elites connected to the wider Near East, some already established in Egypt, some newly arrived, all operating in a landscape where trade, settlement, service, and ambition overlapped. Their power grew in that overlap. They knew routes, horses, materials, weapons, and commercial habits that tied Egypt to places beyond its traditional political imagination. They also understood, perhaps more than later enemies wished to admit, that ruling Egypt required more than standing apart from it. That is why their story is so difficult and so interesting. They did not erase Egypt and replace it with something new, nor did they become merely Egyptian and disappear into the old order. They occupied a middle space. They ruled from Avaris. They adopted royal forms that Egyptians recognized. They used administration. They dealt with local officials. They participated in the religious language of the land, even while preserving ties to other gods and tradition. They learned that legitimacy in Egypt required translation, ritual, symbolism, and continuity, and they were flexible enough to try. Their strength, then, was not just military innovation, though that mattered. It was not only horses or chariots or new bows, though those too would leave a lasting mark. Their deeper strength was political adaptability. They could function in more than one cultural register. They could draw merchants, scribes, soldiers, and craftsmen into a system that felt profitable, workable, even attractive. They could make a multicultural capital function, and they could make much of northern Egypt live with, and sometimes benefit from, the arrangement. Of course, that does not mean everyone accepted them warmly, or that all tensions vanished. Foreign rule remains foreign rule, however, skillful its language. Memory remains, sacred kingship remains, regional pride remains. The South, especially, kept another vision of what Egypt ought to be. Yet for a time, the Hyksos managed something remarkable. They turned uncertainty into leverage. They entered a fractured landscape and built, in the Delta at least, a kingdom that was practical before it was beloved, efficient before it was secure, and real before it was permanent. That balance is what we need to carry with us into the rest of the night. If we hold only the idea of invaders, we miss too much. If we imagine only peaceful blending, we miss just as much. They were rulers from outside the old core of Egypt who rose through a world already in motion. And once in power, they changed the habits of that world by becoming part of it. Like so many things in history, their story begins not with a simple answer, but with a new way of seeing. And the easiest way to see it now is to pass through the gates of explanation and into the palace itself, where the day of a foreign pharaoh begins in the half-light before dawn. There, in the routines of waking and rule, the abstract idea of the Hyksos becomes something more human. A court, a household, a rhythm of papers, prayers, meals, petitions, and decisions. Empires always look different when seen from the inside. Before sunrise, the palace is a place of low sounds and deliberate movement. Linen brushes softly against plastered walls, sandaled feet pass over reed mats. A doorbolt is lifted with care, so the hinges do not speak too loudly into the hour before dawn. In one chamber, a lamp still burns beside a table where the last reader of the night left open, scrolls weighted with polished stone. In another, cool water waits in a wide basin painted with lotus petals and marsh birds. Outside, the first pale blue of morning gathers over the delta, and the city of Avaris begins, very slowly, to remember itself. The king wakes not in a room that feels wholly foreign to Egypt, nor in one that belongs entirely to old Egyptian tradition. That is the point. The bed frame might follow a familiar Egyptian form, but the cedar from which it is made carries the scent of northern hills. The carved chest at the foot of it shows a pattern any Egyptian artisan could recognize, then turns at the edge into a motif that belongs to another visual language. The servants who wait nearby know how to drape the garments of a pharaoh, how to prepare the cosmetics, the seals, the sandals, the insignia. Yet, among them are accents from beyond the delta, inherited names from distant towns, and family histories braided across more than one land. His waking is not theatrical that matters. Power, to endure, must survive the ordinary. Water is poured, hands are washed, a light meal is set out. Simple at first, bread, fruit, beer thinned for the morning. Then come the letters and reports. A scribe, careful and almost invisible in his efficiency, presents sealed notes from provincial officials, lists of stored grain, messages regarding harbor shipments, requests from craftsmen, accounts from tax collectors, and news carried from farther north by merchant agents who know how much information is worth. The king reads, listens, asks, and sometimes simply pauses. Rule is as much waiting as command here in the palace morning. We begin to understand what foreign kingship in Egypt really required. It was not enough to possess force. The river still had to be measured. Storehouses still had to be watched. Roads still had to be secured. Labor still had to be organized. Temples still had to be respected, or at least handled with tact. Egyptian scribal habits, so old and so deeply woven into state life, could not simply be cast aside. They had to be used, and so the palace lives on paper as much as on ritual. It breathes through record-keeping. As the sky brightens, attendants lay out richer garments. The king's appearance matters because kingship in Egypt is seen before it is understood. Jewelry, linen pleating, color, posture, insignia, all of it participates in authority. But authority here has a doubled meaning. Every Egyptian element reassures the eyes of subjects and officials. Every retained foreign habit reminds the court that this rule also comes from somewhere beyond the old order. In that tension, political identity is made each day from scratch. Soon advisors gather. Some are Egyptian by birth, raised in the language of old administration, fluent in precedent, tax categories, storage tallies, district obligations, and temple etiquette. Others belong to families whose roots lie across the northeastern approaches. Families comfortable with caravan routes, horse breeding, long-distance exchange, and the flexible diplomacy of city-states and frontier politics. They speak to one another not as representatives of neat civilizations, but as working officials trying to keep a kingdom stable. The first matters of the day are practical. A canal needs clearing near a village where reeds have choked traffic. A shipment of timber has arrived incomplete, and someone must determine whether the loss was due to theft, river accident, or clever accounting at the point of departure. A quarrel has broken out between two warehouse overseers over seal impressions on jars intended for royal use. None of this sounds glorious, but this is exactly how the state remains real. Empires disappear when they stop paying attention to ordinary friction. Then come the matters that require a different kind of caution. A local official in the south uses titles that suggest a degree of independence the palace does not like. A shrine in one district seeks confirmation of privileges granted under an earlier Egyptian ruler. A community of merchants from the coast asks for protection from excessive fees imposed by a jealous harbor administrator. Each case is small enough to seem minor. Together, they reveal the balancing act at the heart of Hyksos rule. To govern Egypt, the king must seem legitimate to Egyptians, useful to foreign allies, profitable to merchants, reassuring to local elites, and formidable to anyone thinking of testing him. When the morning meal is enlarged, it tells its own story of rule. The grains are Egyptian, drawn from the dark abundance of the floodplain. The oil and certain flavorings may have traveled farther. The vessel shapes on the table do not all belong to one tradition. Even the kitchen, if we pause to think of it, is a map of the kingdom's connections. It is impossible to govern a mixed world for long without eventually eating from it. After the meal comes a brief stillness, a threshold before the public day. The king stands near an opening where the early sunlight enters in a long band across the floor. Beyond the palace walls, the city is now awake. Barges are moving, animals are being let out, bakers have begun somewhere in the market quarter. Scales are already being balanced. He is king not of an abstraction, but of all that movement. Foreign pharaoh, yes, but also the man whose decisions must keep grain flowing, violence limited, labor counted, and symbols intact. This is why the Hyksos matter. In rooms like this one, morning after morning, they learned that conquest was only the beginning of a much stranger task. They had to become intelligible to the civilization they ruled, and they had to do it without fully dissolving into it. Their success lay in how long they managed that impossible performance. And now that the palace has fully awakened, the day must move outward, from private routine into the visible theater of law, religion, and judgment, where kingship must prove itself to more than its own household. When the throne room opens to petitioners, the palace changes its voice. What had been private becomes measured. What had been domestic becomes ceremonial. The room itself is part argument, part performance. Egyptian forms of authority are everywhere. The elevated seat, the framing columns, the orderly placement of attendants, the use of symbols that connect kingship to mat, to rightness, to the proper balance of the world. Yet within that familiar visual language there are subtle displacements, details in dress, decoration, and preference that remind everyone present that the kingdom is being held by hands that came from elsewhere. Cases are heard one by one. A trader complains that copper ingots promised under one contract were delivered at a lower quality than agreed. An Egyptian landholder and a merchant family from the Delta disagree over access to a storeyard and rites of passage to adopt. A marriage dispute arrives, carrying within it questions no older generation of judges had needed to answer in quite this way. Which customs govern property when husband and wife come from different cultural traditions? How are children named, ranked, and protected when family life itself has crossed a border? In each case, the throne room becomes less a place of absolute pronouncement than a chamber of translation. That may be the most remarkable thing about such rule. The Hyksos court could not survive by insisting that one legal world erase another. It had to mediate. Egyptian scribes preserved precedents. Experienced officials knew local habit, interpreters smoothed tone and intent. Men who understood trade beyond the Nile added another layer of practicality. Law here is not pure, it is lived. It bends just enough to keep the kingdom from snapping. Religious life follows a similar pattern. Egypt was never a land in which kings could ignore sacred language. To rule required more than taxation and soldiers, it required placement within a cosmic frame. Temples were old, ritual formulas were old. The gods had histories deeper than most dynasties. A foreign ruler who wished to last had to enter that sacred imagination carefully, respectfully, and with a certain amount of strategic humility. So the Hyksos did what adaptable rulers often do. They identified correspondences. They allowed links to form between their own divine patrons and Egyptian gods who occupied adjacent spaces of meaning. Storm and power, desert and ambiguity, protection and kingship, fertility and authority, all these could be connected if one was willing to think in parallels rather than absolutes. This did not erase difference. An Egyptian priest in the south may well have muttered that some things should never be blended. A conservative household might keep its rituals pure by choice, but in the Delta, in the capital, in the spaces where daily coexistence mattered more than doctrinal purity, hybrid practice became possible. A shrine could gather offerings from people whose grandparents would have prayed differently. A palace ritual might carry an Egyptian public face while allowing quieter loyalties to remain underneath. Such arrangements are fragile, yes, but they are also how multicultural kingdoms continue from season to season. Listen to the room as a judgment is delivered. It is not shouted. It does not need to be. The authority lies in tone, in sequence, in the agreement of clerks, guards, and officials who make the ruling practical. Compensation is set. A warehouse seal is to be inspected again. Witnesses will return after the next market day. A household arrangement is confirmed, so property cannot be quietly diverted by offended relatives. Nothing here sounds grand enough to become legend, yet generations of legend rest on thousands of such moments, the tiny hinges on which order swings. And because law in such a kingdom is always linked to revenue and peace, each judgment also performs another task. It tells people that the court can still absorb complexity. The palace is saying, again and again, bring us your disputes before you turn them into private violence. Bring us your confusion before it becomes rebellion. Bring us the friction created by mixed lives, and let us shape it into tolerable form. That promise, more than any speech, is what keeps a foreign regime from feeling like occupation alone. In quieter corners of the palace, temple privileges are reviewed. Gifts are assigned, and processions are planned with care. Which sanctuaries must receive special attention this season? Which local cults have political significance because they anchor loyalty in a region the court cannot afford to alienate? Which ceremonies must be performed in traditional fashion so no one can say the gods have been forgotten? This is not mere piety. It is governance through sacred continuity. By midday, the throne room has become a map of the whole kingdom's tensions. Trade and kinship, shrines and taxes, language and inheritance, all of it passes briefly before the royal seat. The king does not solve the contradictions once and for all. No ruler ever does. He merely prevents them from breaking the present. And that, in the long story of states, is sometimes enough. When the audience eases and petitioners are led away, what remains in the room is a hush that comes after concentration. Dust turns slowly in the light. Ink dries. The scent of incense clings to cloth and wood. The day has shown us a form of power more delicate than conquest, and perhaps more impressive. The Hyksos ruled not only because they could seize, but because for a time they could reconcile. And once a court can do that, even imperfectly, it opens the way to something broader still, a kingdom facing outward through trade, archives, and distant connection, with Avaris as the hinge between Egypt and a much wider world. If the palace morning teaches us how the Hyksos governed, the archives teach us how far their world reached. There is something deeply calming about imagining shelves, chests, bundled papyri, tablets, ceilings, labels, tags, lists, and letters gathered in shaded rooms, while outside the delta heat thickens. A kingdom becomes larger the moment its records begin to point beyond itself. Under the Hyksos, northern Egypt did not merely collect grain and count labor. It listened outward. In one account, there is timber from the northern coast, valuable not only because Egypt prized good wood, but because the very arrival of such cargo meant a relationship had held long enough, peacefully enough, for ships and handlers and brokers and harbor fees to do their work. In another, there is copper, perhaps from Cyprus, moving through the circuits of exchange that tied bronze working, warfare, craft production, and status display into one long chain of dependence. There are oils, resins, dyes, fine vessels, livestock, and textiles. There are goods whose value lies not in daily need but in prestige, and goods whose importance is practical enough to shape the habits of thousands. The scribe who copies these movements may not think of himself as recording world history. He is doing office work, yet if you lean quietly over his shoulder, line by line, the larger pattern appears. Egypt is no longer only gazing inward at its river and its old monuments. It is being pulled into a broader mesh of roots and interests. Avaris is one reason why, a ruler from a more outward-looking political culture, tied to lands where mobility and exchange mattered differently, sees opportunity where a more insulated court might see inconvenient. This outwardness changes imagination as well as revenue. Merchants arrive from farther away. Interpreters become more valuable. Knowledge of foreign weights, habits, and bargaining customs brings advantage. Families who can move between worlds rise quietly. A young official trained only in older administrative routines is competent. One who can also manage foreign correspondence becomes indispensable. Even curiosity itself becomes useful. Where does that tin come from? Which coastal harbor offers the safest unloading this season? Which city in the north is stable enough to trust with advance shipments? Such questions widen a civilization, not only materially, but mentally. Somewhere in the administrative quarter, a letter is opened and read aloud. It may concern a shipment delayed by weather, a caravan interrupted by banditry, a request for horses, a dispute among merchants, a proposal for mutual convenience between one court and another. The words are practical, but beneath them lies a new geopolitical rhythm. The Hyksos kingdom in the Delta survives not simply by taxing Egypt's soil, but by placing Egypt inside networks of movement. That is part of its strength, and part of what later enemies will remember with unease. It is easy to romanticize such exchange, so we should be gentle with ourselves and keep it ordinary. Trade is not a poetic abstraction, in these rooms. It is accounting, inspection, delay, spoilage, fraud, anxiety, and profit. Cargo is lost. Contracts must be enforced. Weights are checked. Someone is always trying to shave a margin or conceal a defect. Yet, for all that human friction, commerce does something politics alone often cannot. It persuades people of different backgrounds to keep one another legible. To understand the buyer's expectation is not yet friendship, but it is a form of practical peace. The archives also preserve memory in another way. They gather the small decisions by which a foreign dynasty learns how to remain present. They reveal gifts sent to temples, labor assignments, grain disbursements, marriages that matter, titles confirmed, roads repaired, workshops supplied, officers appointed. Written administration turns rule into repetition, and repetition is how the unusual becomes normal. By late afternoon, after the busiest clerical hours have passed, the archive rooms fall into a quieter rhythm. The scratching of reeds on papyrus slows. Seal impressions are left to harden. The heaviest chests remain closed until morning. Dust hangs in bands of light. It is almost possible to forget that the records describe a kingdom balanced between opportunity and resentment, wealth and risk. Almost, and yet this broad, outward-facing world did not live only in offices and harbors. It entered kitchens, gardens, nurseries, and evening rooms. It changed what families ate, what children heard, what servants carried, what queens wore, what stories households told about themselves. So before the day grows too weighty with systems and networks, let us return to a safer chamber in the palace, where power softens into domestic life, and the mixed world of Hyksos, Egypt, becomes quietly human again. In those household spaces, imported goods stop being exotic inventory and become ordinary possessions. Cedar becomes furniture. Foreign oils become scent on the skin. A new kind of harness changes the training of animals. A different metal tool alters the speed of a craftsman's hand. Even the idea of distance changes. Places once known only as rumors at the edge of maps begin to exist in conversation as sources of something tangible, desirable, or useful. This, too, is rule. To widen the horizon of daily expectation is to change the kingdom from within. There were surely men in Egypt who distrusted that widening, who felt the old self-sufficiency of the two lands becoming porous. They were not entirely wrong. Exchange enriches and unsettles in the same motion. But, in the calm order of the archive, the outward turn still looks almost gentle, as if all history were nothing more than one careful list after another. By evening, the palace has another face. The formal pressure of the day loosens. Servants move with less tension in their shoulders. The long corridors no longer carry petitioners and officers in steady succession. Instead, there is lamplight, softer conversation, the clink of vessels being arranged for the final meal, the distant splash of water in a garden basin. It is here, in these hours, when the court is no longer performing power quite so openly, that the Hyksos world becomes easiest to understand. A royal household is always a mirror, though not always an honest one. It reflects not the whole kingdom, but the version of the kingdom that power wants to believe in. Even so, mirrors tell us much. In the evening rooms of Avaris, the meals combine ingredients that have traveled by different routes and become familiar on the same table. Children hear more than one language and think nothing strange of it. A queen may move comfortably through Egyptian forms of ceremony while preserving gestures, ornaments, or devotions that remember another inheritance. Tutors teach writing, etiquette, perhaps music, perhaps calculation, all in a world where belonging is no longer singular. The royal children matter especially, because children normalize what adults still find noteworthy. What one generation calls a compromise, the next may call home. A prince, learning to speak with officials from different communities, is not merely acquiring skill. He is embodying the political project of the dynasty. a princess who knows the festivals of the land, and also the stories carried by her father's people becomes, without intending it, proof that mixed memory can live in one person. After the meal, there may be a walk in the garden. Gardens in Egypt are never only gardens. They are small acts of order in heat and dust, enclosed worlds of shade, water, fragrance, and cultivated calm. In Avaris, even such spaces may carry signs of blending. Lotus and marsh plants beside species favored farther north. Paths laid in one tradition, benches or shaded structures recalling another. Nothing gaudy, just a quiet composite world made habitable by repetition. This is where the harder edges of the day recede, the petitions, the seals, the tax reports, the merchant disputes, the concerns from distant districts. All of it softens for a little while into the simple fact that people must still live inside the structures they create. They must eat, teach, rest, and speak kindly to children before sleep. No dynasty lasts on administration alone, and for all the uncertainty coiled beneath foreign rule, there is real comfort here too. A palace household that can sustain ordinary tenderness has already become more than a military occupation. It has become embedded in time. That does not make it permanent. It only makes its eventual ending more complicated, because endings that involve families never belong to politics alone. For now, though, the lamps burn low, the garden air cools, and the palace withdraws from the strain of judgment into the gentler rhythm of evening light. Beyond its walls, Avaris is still awake. Workshops are closing, taverns are filling, warehouses are being checked one last time before night. And since the city outside has its own softer pulse, we can leave the palace for a while and follow that pulse into the market light of the capital. Morning returns, but now not through palace screens and polished floors. It arrives through shutters pushed open above workshops, through the sweep of a broom across a threshold, through the first water thrown down to settle yesterday's dust in a lane of traders. Avaris in the market hours feels larger than the palace because it belongs to more kinds of life. Here the kingdom becomes audible, scales tap, wheels grind. Loom weights knock softly, bronze tools ring, animals complain. Bargaining begins before the sun is fully warm in the textile court. Dyed fibers hang like captured fragments of dawn and dusk. Linen from Egyptian fields lies beside wools and techniques associated with lands farther north. A weaver's hands know tension, rhythm, and pattern better than most officials know policy, and that matters because cultures often meet first in the hand before they meet in theory. A loom modified by some borrowed idea, a stronger thread arrangement, a new decorative border, a dyeing trick carried across water. These are the kinds of changes that spread quietly until no one remembers the time before them. Nearby, metal workers open their furnace spaces and sort tools while the air is still cool enough to make the first labor feel gentle. Bronze must be melted, shaped, sharpened, hammered, polished. The supply of metal itself already tells a story wider than Egypt. Copper, tin, skill, heat, and exchange all meet here in the workshop. An Egyptian craftsman may produce a blade or clasp that follows an older local taste while using technical knowledge improved through contact with foreign workers or imported standards. The object, when finished, will seem simple. The world required to make it is anything but. At the registration stalls near the commercial square, scribes take down names, quantities, obligations, and disputes with a patience that only bureaucracy can call calm. This too is part of the market. Commerce in a city like Avaris depends on writing as much as on goods. Someone must record what arrived, who claims it, which fee applies, whether a previous debt remains unsettled, whether a caravan master is known and trustworthy, whether a contract from last month has been fulfilled. Here, the cosmopolitan life of the Hyksos capital becomes administrative fact. You can pause beside an official table and watch how many small acts of translation are needed For one shipment to move correctly, a measure familiar to one merchant must be reconciled with another system. A promise made in one language must be copied into a form intelligible to another party. A misunderstanding over quality or delivery must be settled without insulting a profitable partner. The city thrives because enough people in it know how to make such friction survivable. The market is not merely a place of trade then. It is a school in coexistence. An Egyptian buyer learns that the foreign cloth he once found strange is warm, durable, desirable. A merchant from the coast learns that failure to respect local expectations will cost him goodwill faster than it costs him coin. Children running errands grow up hearing multiple accents at once. An artisan seeking better materials comes to rely on roots his grandfather never imagined. This is how Avaris changes Egypt, not by argument alone, but through repeated usefulness. At midday, smells deepen: hot bread, fish, oil, dust, wool, charcoal, sweet beer, leather, resin. There is always more movement than any one eye can follow. Yet the market is never pure chaos. It has its own slow intelligence. Everyone watches everyone else. Prices rise and settle. Information travels without looking like information. A rumor about trouble in the south may pass first as a cautious question over a scale pan. News of a delayed shipment may become a slight tightening in the face of a warehouse clerk who already knows which craftsman will be angry by evening. In such places, the Hyksos order proves itself in a way a monument never could. If the city keeps functioning, if goods keep moving, if officials remain predictable enough, if disputes remain irritating rather than explosive, then the regime has done something right. Prosperity does not make people forget they are being ruled by outsiders, but it can persuade them that disorder would be worse. Toward late afternoon, the pace softens. Merchants begin to count what remains. Apprentices sweep, weavers cover goods. A goldsmith puts aside work too delicate for failing light. A clerk sand dries the last ink on a day's entries. The city exhales without truly resting. In the pause, you can sense another layer beneath commerce, one quieter and more lasting than trade itself. Behind the stalls are houses, behind the houses are kitchens, behind the bargaining voice is a family deciding what kind of life it has become. That is the next place we need to go, because markets can show us how people exchange goods, but only homes can show us how they exchange habits, loyalties, stories, and love. And when foreign rule enters the house, it becomes harder than ever to separate politics from the ordinary warmth of evening light. So, the city teaches two lessons at once. It teaches that power can be practical, and then it teaches that practicality itself can become a kind of attachment. A harbor tax, a verified weight, a reliable supply of copper, a fair hearing over damaged cloth. These do not sound emotional, yet they shape the mood in which people imagine the state. In Avaris, that mood often settled into something watchful but workable, and that made all the difference. When the market closes behind a household, the city changes scale. The public world narrows to doorway, table, lamp, basin, sleeping mat, storage jar, and the familiar pattern of voices that make one place feel like home. In mixed neighborhoods of Avaris, this shrinking of the world does not simplify identity. It reveals it. The closer you come to the evening meal, the more clearly you see what foreign rule has done to ordinary life. Picture a house built in the Delta style, its walls cool where shade still clings to them. The courtyard holds a jug of water, a basket of onions, perhaps a loom leaning against a wall, perhaps a rack of fishing gear or a bundle of reeds not yet used. A husband returns speaking one language with the men outside and another, or partly another, with the family within. A wife has learned to prepare dishes that satisfy inherited tastes from more than one side of the household. Children answer to names shaped by different memories. None of this feels dramatic from inside the home. It feels practical. It feels tender. It feels like adaptation settling into routine. A mixed marriage in such a city is not only a personal union, it is a quiet political fact. Property must be shared, kin must be negotiated with, festive days must be chosen, combined, alternated, or reinterpreted. One grandparent tells a story from the old Egyptian world of temples, river festivals, and divine kingship. Another carries the memory of different hills, different storms, different gods, or at least the names of them. The children grow up hearing both, and because children are generous with reality, they do not always understand why the adults speak of difference in such careful tone. The evening meal is one of history's most reliable schools. You learn a civilization by what can be cooked together without argument. Bread may be Egyptian in grain and method, while the seasoning or side dish hints at another route of memory. Fish from the Nile may be prepared with a flavor borrowed from neighbors whose mothers learned it elsewhere. A storage jar from one craft tradition stands beside bowls shaped by another. Even the way food is shared, served, or blessed can reveal how two worlds have learned, or struggled, to coexist under one roof. After the meal, the house becomes quieter and more revealing still. Accounts may be checked, a child practices signs or syllables under weak light. A garment is mended, someone asks after a relative in another quarter or another town. News from the south is discussed in a lowered voice, so younger ears do not catch the full weight of it. What matters here is not whether such families think of themselves as symbols of a new era. They almost certainly do not. What matters is that history has entered their private tenderness and made it composite. And because tenderness creates loyalty of its own, mixed homes complicate the story of resistance. A man may resent foreign rule and principle, and still love the daughter of a merchant family whose roots lie outside older Egypt. A woman may honor Egyptian ritual and still hope the trade routes protected by the Hyksos remain stable because her children's future depends on them. The house teaches moderation simply because life inside it is too intertwined for slogan. By the time lamps are dimmed and children settle onto bedding, difference no longer feels sharp. It feels textured. A family prayer might invoke forms familiar to one tradition, while carrying quiet gestures inherited from another. A lullaby may not belong wholly to either world. The home does what empire tries and often fails to do. It makes coexistence ordinary, if only within its walls. Outside, the city is still breathing through the harbor, the fields, the workshops, and the roads of exchange. Inside, for a little while, there is only the safety of enclosure, the softness of voices, lowered for night, and the reassuring truth that history, however large, eventually comes down to the people who must sleep within it. Before full light, the harbor belongs to workers. Officials arrive later, merchants later still. But the men and women whose hands move the first catch and the first cargo begin, while the sky is still pearl gray over the water. The delta at this hour feels almost suspended. Mist sits low over the channels. Reeds hold beads of moisture. Nets damp from the day before. Smell of river and labor. Then the first boats push out, and the soft beginning of commerce takes shape in strokes of oars and the quiet discipline of people who know dawn is the most valuable part of the day. Fishing crews in the Hyksos age would have known the Nile and its branches with intimate precision. They knew the moods of water, the seasonal movement of fish, the places where current and stillness met productively. But under a more connected delta economy, even that old knowledge could change. New netting techniques, better cordage, information from coastal traditions, improved hooks or methods of preserving catch, all of this could filter into local practice. Not every innovation arrives with ceremony. Many arrive because someone notices that another way works. On one boat, two partners move almost without speaking, because dawn work asks for rhythm rather than discussion. One learned river habits from his father. The other may carry techniques whose origin lies nearer the eastern Mediterranean shore. Between them, the craft becomes more effective than either tradition alone. That is one of the great quiet themes of this era. Cooperation in a working environment does not need ideology to sustain it. It needs results. A fuller net persuades faster than a speech. By sunrise, the harbor edge has become alert. Women waiting to buy fresh fish assess size, species, smell, and likely price with hard practical intelligence. Porters shoulder baskets. A registrar notes quantities meant for larger buyers. Salted stores are inspected. There is nothing glamorous about this. And that is exactly why it matters. If foreign rule reshapes the routines of food supply, then it has reached the deepest layer of social life. People can argue about kings, but they still need today's catch. Harbor commerce also teaches flexibility. Fish destined for a local household need not be handled the same way as fish intended for salting, trading, or supplying elite kitchens. Demand shifts with season, festival, wealth, and traffic. A city like Avaris, full of travelers and officials, requires regular provisioning. So the harbor becomes a place where knowledge of appetite, storage, and movement creates value. A successful seller is not simply lucky. She knows who is visiting, who is paying well, which household has guests, which quarter expects a feast, which warehouse needs provisions for a cruise loading overnight. The water, meanwhile, keeps time more gently than the market square. Boats come and go. The same channels that carried papyrus stalks and grain for generations now also carry a more outward-looking economy. Harbor workers hear accents from other places because the river is no longer only Egypt's interior road. It is part of a broader system that links inland plenty to maritime ambition. Even simple labor thus acquires a wider horizon. A porter lifting baskets at Avaris may never see a northern coast, but his day's work belongs to those routes whether he knows it or not. By late morning, the intensity eases slightly. Nets are repaired in shade. Knots are retied. A boy sent on errands lingers long enough to hear older workers talk of market prices, taxes, road safety, and rumors from upriver. Harbors collect information the way reeds collect silt. News arrives there because movement arrives there. If trouble is growing in the south, the harbor senses it early, not as a proclamation, but as a change in tone. A merchant hesitates before committing to a shipment. A warehouse clerk grows careful with outgoing inventory. Someone asks whether armed escorts are still available on a certain route. Yet, even with that undercurrent, the harbor remains one of the most soothing spaces in the story. There is repetition here, and repetition is comforting. Cast, haul, sort, wash, gut, salt, carry, weigh, sell, mend, wait. The motions themselves become almost hypnotic. The workers do not need history to become meaningful in their hands. They need the day to continue, the boat to hold, the buyer to pay fairly enough, the water to remain legible, and the body to remain strong until evening. When afternoon light thickens and the water turns brighter, the crews head out again or pull in for maintenance, depending on their luck and their obligations. Children help clean tools. Women bargain one last time over what remains. A cook planning the night's meal chooses according to household means. A merchant calculates margin. A clerk closes a tablet or rolls a list. The harbor never truly stops, but it changes mood, and that mood, now slower, invites us inland. Because behind the harbor lie the fields that feed the city, and behind those fields lies another part of the Hyksos transformation. One quieter still than trade. The work of cultivation, irrigation, and rural routine, where change enters life so slowly that it can almost feel like the land itself has decided to do things different. Beyond the busier streets of Avaris, the delta opens into a quieter geometry. Channels branch, dikes guide water, fields lie in patient squares and strips under the changing light. Villages cluster in low forms of mud brick and packed earth, close enough to the cultivated land that the daily walk to work is not really a walk at all, just a continuation of domestic life into the open air. Here, in the agricultural belt around the capital, the drama of foreign kingship becomes almost invisible. And yet, perhaps nowhere is it more important. Farming in Egypt had always depended on intimate knowledge of flood, silt, season, and labor. That old wisdom did not disappear under the Hyksos, nor could it have. The Nile was older than any dynasty and less interested in ideology than in timing. But periods of contact and movement can still reshape agriculture, not by replacing local understanding, but by modifying. New seed varieties might be introduced, animal management could change, tools could be reinforced or slightly redesigned, water control might become more precise in certain districts. Storage methods could improve. The sum of these changes is rarely dramatic when viewed year by year. Across a generation, it can be enormous. A farmer stepping into his field at dawn does not speak in terms of civilizational fusion. He thinks of soil moisture, labor needs, the condition of a plow beam, the behavior of draft animals, whether one section of channel must be cleared before midday, whether grain in storage is holding dry, whether a son can be spared to help a neighbor and still return in time for the household's own work. Yet, the world around him may already contain more borrowed usefulness than he realizes. A more durable fitting here, a more efficient storage jar there, a new breed of sheep producing different wool, a canal gate designed with better control, a habit of record keeping that allows a landlord or administrator to predict obligations more accurately. All of it shapes the field while pretending to be ordinary. The morning in such villages begins with work divided, but connected. Men and older boys lead animals, inspect channels, lift, cut, mend, measure. Women grind grain, prepare food, tend dairy work, spin fiber, care for children, and often do far more in the fields than later simplifications of history like to admit. Knowledge circulates across these tasks. A woman preserving milk or monitoring grain spoilage is participating in the same economic world as a merchant at Avaris, just at another point in the chain. Rural life under the Hyksos is not outside the new order. It is one of the foundations that make the order possible. There's a deep peace in imagining irrigation just before noon. Water slides through cut channels with a sound gentler than speech. Mud holds the memory of recent work. A young boy is sent with a tool to clear a blockage and returns splashed to the knees, proud of the task. A herder guides animals across the edge of a field. Someone pauses in the shade to drink and look over what has been done. This is the realm in which stability matters most. No farmer needs a dynasty to be glorious. He needs it to avoid ruining the conditions in which the crop can come in. That practical truth helps explain why foreign rule could be tolerated, even accommodated, for as long as it was. If taxes remained predictable enough, if local administration functioned, if violence did not regularly destroy planting schedules, if trade kept certain goods available, if the capital provided a market for surplus, then many rural communities could live within the new arrangement. They might not love it. Love is too grand a word for most people's relationship with power. But they could work under it. And working under something for long enough changes the texture of resistance. At midday, the village slows. Animals are watered. Bread is broken. Shade becomes precious. Here the world's wider networks feel far away, but only for a moment. A tool of foreign design lies beside an old basket form. A visiting official brings news from the capital. A peddler offers something from a distant route. A child practices a sign learned from someone who served in town. Influence enters the countryside less by declaration than by repeated contact. The afternoon belongs to maintenance as much as production. Ditches must hold. Storerooms must stay dry. Walls need patching. Grain must be protected from damp, pests, and theft. A kingdom that reaches outward through trade still depends, in the end, on disciplined local repetition. That is why the Hyksos, like any rulers hoping to last, needed the countryside to remain functional. Prosperity in the delta could not rest only on harbor wealth. It needed barley, emmer, fodder, flax, milk, labor, and patience. As evening stretches longer, village life gathers itself again. Smoke rises low. Children are called back from edges of fields and banks of channels. Someone plays a simple tune. Someone counts jars. Someone discusses, not for the first time, whether the district official this year seems fair or grasping. News from farther south may arrive as rumor. Unrest, proud princes, talk of restoring a purer Egyptian kingship. Such talk will sound different in a rural settlement than in the palace. Here, it is weighed against harvest, against sons of marriageable age, against stored grain, against the cost of disorder. So even the fields around Avaris participate in the larger tension of the age. They are peaceful, but their peace is conditional. Their productivity enriches a kingdom some will later call foreign and illegitimate. Their routines have quietly absorbed useful changes from that kingdom. Their people may feel attachment to old Egyptian continuity and still hesitate before any movement that threatens working stability. In this way, the countryside becomes one more place where the Hyksos project succeeds precisely by entering ordinary life. And when darkness comes over irrigation water, it comes beautifully. Channels reflect the first stars. Frogs begin. The heat loosens. Houses draw their families inward. Whatever names rulers use for themselves, whatever titles they claim, the field at night remains one of history's most merciful constants. It asks only that someone return at dawn. And while we leave those fields for now, we carry their calm with us into another world of repeated motion and skilled patience. The workshops where clay, heat, metal, and hands turn raw matter into the crafted life of the kingdom. If the fields teach patience through season, the workshops teach patience through repetition. Enter one at the right hour, and you hear the kingdom in another register entirely. The turning of a wheel, the scrape of smoothing, the measured strike of hammer on softened metal, the crackle of kiln heat, the soft cough of charcoal dust in the back of a craftsman's throat. These are not the sounds of proclamations. They are the sounds of continuity made by hand. A potter begins with earth, but not just any earth, and not with earth alone. Clay must be chosen, tempered, kneaded, tested. Water must be added in the right amount, not merely by measure, but by feel. The wheel turns, and the body learns to trust what the fingers already know. A vessel rises. It does not matter much whether the shape is intended for a royal storeroom, a merchant's cargo, a domestic pantry, or a shrine offering. In each case, the act is part of a larger system of living. Pottery is one of civilization's quiet skeletons. It carries food, oil, ink, perfume, grain, ceilings, memory. Under the Hyksos, as in other periods of contact, workshop life could absorb new influences without advertising them. A vessel form preferred by another market, a kiln method that improves consistency, a decorative line borrowed and then naturalized, a better bronze edge for trimming, a more efficient way to stack wares for transport. To later historians, these details may seem small. To the artisan, they are the difference between waste and sale, between a cracked batch and a profitable one. Metalworking makes the point even more sharply. Bronze is never only bronze. It is mining, transport, trade, alloying knowledge, heat control, skilled labor, and demand. In a delta world increasingly connected outward, the workshop depends on far-flung relationships almost as much as the archive does. The smith may never see the island or mine from which copper came, but he knows the quality of the ingot in his hand. He knows what a flawed metal supply means for a blade, a chisel, a fitting, or a weapon. Through him, the broad networks of the Hyksos kingdom become intimate. There is something especially soothing about craft work because it turns history into process. The same motions are repeated, refined, and trusted. Apprentices watch, masters correct gently or sharply, waste is swept, tools are arranged in habitual order, a glaze test fails and someone mutters but begins again. A small success brightens the room for no one beyond those who understand how difficult it was. In such spaces, politics exists mostly as condition. Is metal available? Is fuel expensive? Are taxes bearable? Are buyers still coming? Beyond that, the work itself takes over. Yet, condition matters. A city like Avaris, plugged into trade and court demand, offers workshops opportunities that isolated villages cannot. Elite taste can sustain luxury craft. Foreign merchants can create new markets. Administrative regularity can make supply more reliable. Even military needs, however ominous, stimulate production of fittings, weapons, harness parts, storage containers, and transport gear. The Hyksos age, for all its eventual instability, gave craftsmen reasons to adapt. By afternoon, the light in the workshop becomes golden and angled. Clay vessels are laid aside to dry. Bronze glows differently as it cools. A leather apron is hung from a peg. Someone counts finished pieces against an order list. Someone else covers raw material against damp. In that tired but satisfying hour after concentrated labor, the worker feels what all useful systems create: the relief of being needed by a world larger than oneself. And yet, craft also offers refuge from that world. A potter centering clay cannot think too hard about dynastic legitimacy. A metal worker aligning a rivet or edge is loyal, for the moment, only to the logic of the object before him. This is part of the great sleep content gold within history. Work that is exacting enough to absorb the mind, repetitive enough to calm it, and meaningful enough to make the surrounding world feel held together. When evening comes, workshops close, one by one. Doorways are swept, kilns are checked, unfinished tasks are set in order for morning. The street outside gathers the last warmth of the day. And as craftsmen turn homeward, carrying fatigue in their arms and fine dust in the folds of their clothes, we can feel the story preparing to shift. For all this quiet productivity has been possible because another machine stands behind it, less soothing and more decisive: the organized power of horse, chariot, command, and armed rule. The training ground wakes under a different kind of discipline. There is no market murmur here, no domestic softness, no workshop absorption. The air smells of leather, horse sweat, dust, and metal warmed early by the sun. Order is cut cleanly through the morning. Wheels are inspected, harnesses are checked, bowstrings are tested. Men move in patterns drilled into them so often that the body responds before thought fully arrives. It is not chaos, and that is what makes it formidable. One of the enduring marks of the Hyksos in Egyptian memory is the association with horses, chariots, and new forms of warfare. Later, Egypt would not forget that lesson, but before it becomes legacy, it exists as training, and training is patient. The chariot is not only a weapon, it is a system. It requires wood, leather, metal fittings, wheelcraft, horse management, road or terrain understanding, and men who can coordinate speed with control. It is the product of the very outward-facing world the Hyksos helped strengthen in the Delta. Trade, craft, and war meet in its frame. On the ground, the practice looks almost beautiful from a distance. Teams circle, halt, pivot, and accelerate in repeated arcs that raise controlled clouds of dust. Composite bows are lifted and loosed in sequence. Drivers and fighters must trust one another absolutely. A missed grip, a frightened horse, a broken wheel, and the elegance vanishes at once. That fragility is part of the power. Sophisticated systems often appear effortless, only after long labor hides beneath them. For Egypt, whose military habits had once leaned more heavily on older forms of infantry and river-based movement, Such innovations changed not only tactics but imagination. Speed altered the map, range altered confidence. The ability to move force quickly across certain kinds of terrain gave a ruler options that had not existed in the same way before. In the Hyksos kingdom, military organization was not an ornament to rule. It was one of the conditions that made foreign rule possible at all. And yet even here, in the most martial part of the story, there is mixture rather than purity. Egyptian recruits learn the newer methods. Men from families tied to Levantine traditions serve beside them. Why? Commands, jokes, curses, and small acts of comradeship cross cultural boundaries because competence on a training field has little patience for ideology. A wheel either holds or it does not. An archer either hits or misses. A team either trusts its rhythm or pays for the failure. Shared danger makes practical equals of men long before politics does. By midday, the drills shift. Not all training is speed. Some is maintenance, repair, posture, discipline, and logistics. A state does not defend itself through heroics alone. It survives through feed stores, replacement parts, horse care, route knowledge, and communication. This is where the military machine resembles the palace more than it first appears. Both are systems of repetition. Both depend on dependable people doing unglamorous things well. The softer truth, beneath all this readiness, is that the army exists to preserve the conditions we have already seen. The market's functionality, the harbor's rhythm, the field's productivity, the workshop's patience, the household's sleep. Power in arms is the hard shell around those quieter forms of life. A foreign dynasty understands that especially well because it cannot afford to forget what would happen if force ceased to look credible. Late in the day, after the loudest exercises are over, the training grounds quiet to a more reflective pace. Tack is cleaned, horses are walked down, men talk in smaller groups. Someone compares an old style of fighting with a newer one. Someone worries about reports from the south. Someone insists the delta remains secure. Someone else says nothing, which can mean more than speech. The martial world has sensed what the merchants sensed earlier, that efficiency and strength do not remove the possibility of future strain. Still, for now, the order holds. Dust settles back to earth. Wheels are stored under shade. The camp or compound prepares its evening meal. And the story does not leap straight from training into battle, because real crises rarely arrive that cleanly. Before open conflict, there is always another stage, quieter and more dangerous. Reports, whispers, diplomats, informants, and the long murmur of news traveling up from Thebes. If the training ground is where power becomes visible, the intelligence room is where power becomes anxious. Such rooms need not be grand. A table, lamps, sealed messages, a few trusted officials, perhaps a map, or at least a mental geography shared by everyone present. That is enough. The mood is different from the market's practical energy or the palace court's ceremonial balance. Here, uncertainty enters the kingdom in folded form. Reports from the south do not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they come as small irregularities, a title used too boldly by a local ruler, a temple declaration heard and repeated farther than expected, a messenger delayed for reasons that may be innocent or may not be. Theban pride, old and deeply rooted, does not need to invent reasons for resentment. It only needs time to organize them, and time, like water, is always moving. Officials in Avaris understand the stakes. Northern prosperity can create the illusion that successful administration is enough, that a well-run mixed kingdom will justify itself. But legitimacy in Egypt has never rested on utility alone. Sacred continuity matters, the memory of native kinship matters, the emotional geography of Upper Egypt is not the same as the Delta's practical cosmopolitanism. Avaris may feel like the future. Thebes remembers another past and believes it still has a claim on it. So letters are read carefully. Who is speaking with whom? Which southern houses are coordinating? Are they merely posturing or preparing? Have they begun to learn from Hyksos' military methods? Are foreign advisors, mercenaries, or trading partners quietly supplying them? Does dissatisfaction in one district reflect elite pride, priestly hostility, popular hardship, or all three at once? Intelligence work is exhausting because it asks men to build certainty out of smoke. Diplomacy enters here as both tool and sedative, if trade routes can be protected. If neighboring powers remain neutral, if communication stays open, then perhaps tension can be managed. A message sent at the right moment can sometimes delay a war. A gift can cool a grievance. A carefully chosen title can preserve face without surrendering substance. The Hyksos, outward-looking by necessity, are well suited to this kind of politics. They know that force is expensive and uncertainty contagious. Yet diplomacy also reveals weakness. One negotiates hardest over what one fears cannot simply be commanded. If the South were fully harmless, there would be no need for such care. Thus, every polite exchange with a potentially hostile region contains within it the shadow of preparation. One eye remains on roads, another on storehouses, another on officers whose loyalty must never be assumed. The evening deepens, lamps are trimmed, scribes summarize. A trusted advisor speaks more frankly once lesser attendants have withdrawn. This is often how turning points sound in history at first. Not trumpet calls, but lowered voices admitting that conditions have changed. The old assumption that the Delta can remain prosperous while the South remains merely resentful begins to fray. Resentment is gathering shape. Memory is becoming program. Outside these rooms, the city still moves through its ordinary life. Children are being called indoors. Fish is being salted. Workers are eating. Priests are making evening offerings. That contrast matters. Intelligence work always takes place against the stubborn continuity of the daily world. The kingdom is most fragile precisely when most people still hope tomorrow will resemble today. Before true crisis, there is a long hush made of rumor, interpretation, and incomplete knowledge. The Hyksos now live inside that hush. They can still act, they can still plan, they can still believe that skill, wealth, military edge, and careful management will be enough. But the messages from Thebes are no longer background noise. They are becoming the low drum beneath every decision. And as that drum continues, the next movement of the story is not an explosion, but a drift, the slow, unmistakable rise of resistance. Resistance does not begin on the battlefield. It begins in mood, in language, in the reawakening of old certainty. Somewhere in the South, in halls older in spirit than the mixed rooms of Avaris, men begin to speak not merely of grievance, but of restoration. Egypt, they say, should belong again to Egyptian kings. Sacred order should no longer be filtered through foreign hands. The land should be made one under rulers who need no translation to justify themselves. It would be easy to cast this as pure patriotism and leave it there, but history is rarely that clean. Pride is involved, certainly. So is religion. So is ambition. So is regional rivalry. Southern elites have reasons of their own to resent Delta wealth and Delta centrality. Priests have reasons to distrust hybrid sacred language. Families excluded from influence under Hyksos rule can dress political hunger in the garments of purity. Yet even when motives mix, the emotional force remains powerful. Restoration is one of the most potent promises any movement can make. And there is an irony at the center of it. The Hyksos changed Egypt so effectively that the Egypt moving against them is no longer the same Egypt they once entered. Military methods have spread. Political imagination has widened. The very pressures of foreign rule have sharpened a sense of native kingship in opposition. In a strange way, the rulers of Avaris helped create the conditions of the challenge they now face. For those living in the Delta, Resistance arrives first as uncertainty. Will roads remain safe? Will taxes rise to fund defense? Will sons be called up? Will merchants hold back goods? Will mixed households be judged with suspicion if identities harden? People who have learned to live within a composite world begin to fear that the future may demand simpler loyalties than life itself can honestly provide. That is why the rise of resistance carries melancholy as much as danger. The challenge from Thebes is not only a military threat. It is a threat to the layered, negotiated, sometimes awkward, often productive world that has taken shape under Hyksos rule. Markets, homes, workshops, and fields all feel the air change even before formal war. At dusk, when news is discussed in lowered voices and lamps are lit against the dark, one truth becomes harder to avoid. The Hyksos may still hold power, still possess wealth, still command innovation, but they no longer own the story of Egypt uncontested. Another story has awakened, and it speaks in the older language of rightful kingship, sacred continuity, and return. Once that story gains momentum, no system, however practical, remains entirely safe. So the kingdom enters a new emotional weather, not collapse yet, not even open defeat, just the sense that the ground beneath daily life is no longer as steady as it seemed. And from that quiet instability, the final chapter begins to form. Still, evenings continue, bread is baked, nets are mended, canal gates are checked. A child asks for another story before sleep. This persistence of ordinary life makes coming change feel even stranger. History almost never pauses daily tenderness before it moves on. It simply passes through it and asks everyone to go on living while the shape of the world shifts around them. When open resistance finally hardens, it does not erase the long years that came before. That is important to remember. The last chapter of the Hyksos in Egypt is often told quickly, as if history were eager to sweep away ambiguity and restore a simpler moral order. But nothing about this ending is simple if we have spent the night inside the world they built. By the time southern kings, such as Kamose, begin pressing north more aggressively, the conflict is not between a pure Egypt and an untouched foreign camp. It is between two futures both already changed by contact. The rulers in Avaris still have strengths. They know administration. They command wealth. They possess fortified positions in the delta, access to trade, experience with complex logistics, and military habits that once gave them a decisive edge. But time has a way of redistributing advantage. Innovations do not remain loyal forever. Once others learn the value of horses, chariots, composite bows, and organized supply, the gap begins to narrow. What made the Hyksos formidable also becomes part of the larger Egyptian future that will outlive them. There is sadness in that, though not necessarily injustice. History often keeps the tool and dismisses the hand that introduced it. The Delta Kingdom discovers, too late perhaps, that changing a civilization is not the same as ensuring gratitude from it. Practical success can sustain a regime for years. It cannot always silence the deeper pull of identity, memory, and sacred legitimacy once those forces gather themselves with enough discipline. You can imagine the atmosphere in Avaris during those final tense seasons. Officials still work because government cannot simply stop. Storehouses are still counted, horses are still fed, messengers still arrive mud-spattered and urgent. Families still eat together in the evening, markets still open, though perhaps with greater caution in every glance. Children still ask questions adults do not want to answer directly. The city keeps breathing because cities do, even when their future has begun to contract. News from the south comes with sharper edges now, no longer rumor alone, campaigns, declarations, claims of rightful reunification. The language of expulsion, the sense that compromise itself has become suspect. For the mixed world of the Delta, that is perhaps the most painful turn. A system built on negotiation now faces an enemy energized by refusal. When legitimacy hardens into purity, hybrid arrangements lose room to speak for themselves. And still, we should resist the urge to make the end too loud. Even the fall of a dynasty contains long stretches of waiting. Garrison reports, delayed responses, anxiety disguised as routine, an officer checking the same harness twice, a clerk reviewing supply tallies by dimmer light than usual, a household deciding which goods could be moved quickly if movement became necessary. Fear, in real historical time, is often administrative before it becomes dramatic. As pressure increases, some people in Avaris will have looked north or east in thought, toward old connections beyond the delta. Others will have clung more tightly to the Egyptian life they had built where they were. Some likely believed the kingdom could still hold. Some surely knew it could not. Such diversity of feeling is one of the quiet truths lost whenever later victors flatten whole populations into a single defeated category. In the end, the Hyksos do lose their grip on Egypt. Wow. Southern rulers press the claim of native kingship, and the age of Delta foreign rule closes. Later tradition remembers the expulsion more clearly than the centuries of slow entanglement that made the conflict meaningful. That is often how cultural memory works. It prefers decisive endings to difficult coexistence. But the deeper story does not close with expulsion. It lingers in what remains behind. The Egyptian state that emerges stronger in the wake of conflict is not the same state that once faced the rise of the Hyksos. It has learned, it has absorbed, it carries forward military techniques, strategic awareness, and a sharpened understanding of the northeastern frontier. It knows more clearly that the delta can be a gateway as well as a vulnerability. It has seen how a foreign connected capital can harness trade and mobility. Even in rejection, it inherits. That is why the Hyksos matter so much. They were not merely a break in Egyptian continuity. They became part of continuity by forcing it to adapt. They showed that Egypt could be entered, altered, and linked outward in new ways. They also showed how deeply Egyptians cared about kingship, memory, and the emotional shape of legitimacy. Their reign exposed the flexibility of the civilization and also its boundaries. Few historical episodes reveal both so clearly. So tonight, as we let the final lamps dim in Avaris, it may help to picture not one dramatic ending, but many overlapping afterlives. A chariot wheel turning under a ruler who no longer names the Hyksos with anything but contempt. A military planner in a later Egyptian court, thinking in ways the Hyksos helped normalize. A family in the Delta continuing a household habit whose origin no one can now cleanly trace. A merchant route still active because connection, once proven useful, is hard to abandon altogether. A child grown to adulthood remembering that the world was once broader at home than older stories allowed. The city itself begins to quiet again. The warehouses darken, the workshops cool. The channels beyond the walls carry black water under stars that have watched every dynasty believe, for a while, that it could define the future alone. Somewhere in the marshes a bird calls. Somewhere in a house, a mother settles a sleeping child. Somewhere in an archive chest lies a record of some transaction, so ordinary no scribe imagined it would outlast the fall of king. Yet ordinary things often do. And if there is a lesson gentle enough to carry towards sleep, perhaps it is this. Civilizations are not changed only by those they welcome. They are also changed by those they resist, absorb, reject, imitate, and later try to forget. The Hyksos did not remain in Egypt forever, but forever is not the measure of influence. Sometimes a people alter the course of a civilization simply by ruling it for a time in a different key, by widening its roads, unsettling its certainties, and leaving behind tools, fears, opportunities, and memories that do not vanish when their names grow dim. So we do not close the door too firmly on them. We leave it slightly open, as night itself leaves every ancient city partly unfinished. The Nile still moves in darkness. The Delta still breathes. The old arguments about belonging and power sink into the reeds for a while. And somewhere, beyond the edge of sleep, Avaris remains, half remembered and half imagined, resting under the stars as if the next day has not yet decided what kind of history it will become.